Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're watching a special edition of The Listening Post on the Snowden effect, changes occurring in journalism in the age of the surveillance state. When Edward Snowden decided he was going to take all those classified U.S. intelligence documents and make them public, he knew that his emails to journalists could well be intercepted by the same people that the story was about, the National Security Agency, his employer. So he secured his lines of communications. Glenn Greenwald, who was at The Guardian at the time, almost missed breaking the story of the NSA surveillance program because when Snowden asked him to install an encryption tool called PGP, Greenwald failed. Snowden then turned to another journalist who knew Greenwald, someone who was better schooled in the dark arts of digital communication, who then got the documents to The Guardian and eventually out to the world. 1 year into the Snowden story, one of the biggest lessons that journalists can draw is this: if you're no good at encryption, how can sources trust you to protect their anonymity? And if that's the case, why would a source, any source, trust you with their story? This week, we're digging into what they call the deep web. In part two, a feature interview with a Guardian journalist who worked on the Snowden story. But first, we'll explore one of the growth industries in the world of journalism, the encryption tools that more and more reporters are using to get the story, keep the powers that be accountable, to protect their sources, and to do it all without leaving so much as an electronic trace.
The journalist has to take extra security precautions because they're the ones that are ultimately protecting the material that sources send them.
When you see a video on the news of atrocities being committed by regimes, then if that source is still alive, chances are they've been using digital security tools.
Yeah, whether you agree with what Edward Snowden did or not, it brought a whole ton of attention to how pervasive spying has become.
The Edward Snowden NSA surveillance story did eventually make it into print, but it took a while. Having taken the initiative, Snowden did not want to risk sending classified intelligence documents unencrypted. He instructed Glenn Greenwald on how to install PGP, an encryption tool that has been around for 2 decades. Greenwald didn't really get it and failed to take those measures. Snowden then contacted another journalist, Laura Poitras, an American based in Berlin who was familiar with encryption, who then let Greenwald know what Snowden had. The rest is history written in headline form. And since then, more and more journalists have been schooling themselves on what is now a tool of the trade, encryption.
What the Snowden revelations did is not necessarily tell us things on a technical level that we didn't understand. It just led people to understand the true scope of mass surveillance. And now I've been doing journalist trainings for about 2 years. And before the revelations, the digital security track at a conference wasn't particularly well attended. Now it's standing room only, and that's a really good thing.
They don't really need to listen to your phone calls. If they can pick up all the information about the connections and when they happen and all this, you can kind of figure out what people were doing and talking about anyway without ever even listening to them. These digital cookie crumbs we're always leaving around when we're communicating, all of these things can be very dangerous for journalists.
There are 2 ways, mainly, that journalists can be exposed over what they do on the web. First, their direct communications, primarily emails. And then there's the trail they leave on their web travels, the metadata. PGP stands for Pretty Good Privacy, but the name sells the tool short. Its developers say it has never been cracked. Anyone who wants to cover their metadata tracks and avoid unwanted observation can use the TOR network. TOR stands for the onion router, and as the name suggests, it uses layers and layers of encryption, a kind of cloaking device built for cyberspace. With more on how journalists are securing their communications and covering their tracks on the web, here's the Listening Post's Will Young.
For the security-conscious journalist, these 2 freely available tools really are essential. One converts content into uncrackable code, and the other keeps your online activities under the radar. First, PGP. Now, I'm using an extension for Google Chrome called Mailvelope, which I can use to generate my all-important personal key. Now, this consists of a private key that only I have access to, and a public key that I can make available to the people I want to communicate with. Now that my key is ready, I'm going to send the public part of it to my colleague Paolo. He's also sent me his public key. When I want to send an email, I can choose to encrypt it. I'm going to encrypt this message for Paolo's eyes only. Now, PGP uses my private key and Paolo's public key to turn my message into encrypted text. It's not quite security at the click of a mouse, but these are the steps that you have to take to keep your communication safe. Now, while encryption means that the content of your communications cannot be intercepted, information about your online movements, your metadata, can reveal a lot about you, such as what websites you're visiting or who you're communicating with. But if you use Tor to connect to the internet, your data bounces through a network of volunteer servers. It's a bit like taking an indirect route through town to shake off someone who's following you. Not only that, Tor also wraps your data in multiple layers of encryption. Each Tor server that your packet encounters on its path can unwrap and decrypt only one layer of that encryption. Enough information to send it on its path, but not enough to connect the identity of the sender with its ultimate destination. Getting acquainted with PGP and the Tor browser are the first steps for the privacy-conscious journalist who wants to communicate securely with sources.
Building on the multi-layered encryption of Tor is the latest in security communications tools, a system that's user-friendly enough that even the least tech-savvy journalist or source can make it work. It's called SecureDrop, and it was developed in part by an American nonprofit, the Freedom of the Press Foundation, whose mission it is to support and defend journalism that is in the public interest. SecureDrop is now featured on many news websites and offers a safe landing spot for sensitive information, a safe haven for the sources who use it to get that information out.
SecureDrop is essentially an open source whistleblower submission system that allows sources to more anonymously and securely get documents and tips to journalists and news organizations. And Freedom of the Press Foundation took over the management of the SecureDrop project in the fall of 2013. We've updated SecureDrop to the point where we think it's really easy for sources to be able to use. We're actually helping media organizations install it. Since late 2013, we've had at least a half a dozen media organizations install SecureDrop and are using it regularly, including in the US, the New Yorker magazine, Forbes, ProPublica, and Glenn Greenwald's new news organization, The Intercept.
I think that sources are more likely to contact those journalists and those news organizations. And so the news organizations that want the big stories are going to need to start using encryption, and they're going to need to start setting up SecureDrop, and they're going to need to make things safe for their sources, or they're not going to get them.
This isn't just a story about the NSA, Washington, or the government there. Governments the world over have their secrets, and more now have the means to find the sources who reveal them. Beijing has tracked sources feeding American journalists stories about government corruption in China. The email accounts of Chinese journalists and those in Hong Kong are routinely compromised. Egypt is stepping up social media monitoring to keep a lid on dissent or keep tabs on anything to do with the banned Muslim Brotherhood. And the Assad government in Syria has looked into technology that can intercept, scan, and catalog emails. Given all of that, journalists and their sources, wherever they are, need to know that their communications are safe. Yet, for some reason, the same reporters who will routinely work the phone for hours or research a story down to the most minute detail often fail to bring that same kind of diligence to communicating securely. Journalism has been called covering history on the run, and electronic communication has made journalism faster, more responsive. Whether it's that need for speed, a sense of complacency, or an assumption that encryption is too complicated, too technical, not enough reporters are taking the necessary precautions.
Unfortunately, I don't think the deep web and all of these anonymity and encryption tools have really reached the mainstream of journalism and the general public yet. Right now, the big problem with all these encryption tools is they're very secure, but not necessarily the easiest to use for regular users who aren't steeped in security.
No matter what tools you're using, I mean, the reality is we're humans and we're flawed and we can be tricked. We can be confused, we can make mistakes, and all of these things ultimately will lead to intelligence agencies and spies and other people to be able to continue to do their jobs, and they depend on us being human. The computers can be perfect, but the humans won't be. You really need to be trained by somebody who understands both what it is to be in the position of a journalist who may be under threat of a government, and also really understands the security implications.
And the implications are serious. The Obama administration is obsessed with whistleblowers who reveal national security secrets, prosecuting them in record numbers. The British government has gone after The Guardian, at one stage forcing the newspaper to destroy hard drives full of Snowden files. These are touchy times for journalists reporting on security matters, and downright scary times for sources who governments are far, far more likely to prosecute than the reporters they talk to. And that is reason enough for journalists and the organizations they work for to get up to speed on encryption.
As we saw in the Snowden case, you have to have encryption. You have to have the ability to protect your sources on a technical level in order to get stories. As we saw in the Greenwald and Snowden case, journalists need the ability to encrypt their communications and do everything that they can on a technical level to protect their sources. Otherwise, they're not going to get the same stories.
Everybody that works at The Intercept uses PGP. All of our email is encrypted. And I think that that's the responsible thing to do when you're doing journalism and when you're dealing with sources. Glenn Greenwald almost lost the biggest story of his life because he wasn't using PGP. And I think that there's more sources out there with really big stories, and they're going to find the journalists that they trust and that also know how to protect them.
Our Global Village voice is now on the importance of secure communications between reporters and their sources.
Like all users, reporters have centralized most of their communications and metadata on just a handful of giant services like Google and Facebook and Twitter. This made inevitable the use of that massive data trove by people who see information as power to be collected rather than knowledge to be shared. If we keep making giant piles of data, governments and corporations will continue to paw through our lives at will and for their own purposes. We need to move our communication to truly private infrastructure and encrypt that data so that the snoops will have nothing to listen to.
We at IRPI implemented a whistleblowing platform back in November 2013 called IRPI-Leaks. IRPI-Leaks makes use of the Tor browser. We do receive a fair number of leaks on a regular basis. At the moment, the majority of the leaks we received are about possible wrongdoings and lack of transparency in the public administration of sector. We strongly believe that IRPI-Leaks can contribute greatly to expose corruption and above all to give the public a role in making things better.
India is quite familiar with phone tapping. The government has invested in something called the Central Monitoring System, which can intercept real-time communication and internet-based communication. And for that reason, we must start talking and thinking and investing in encryption technologies to protect journalism, as it were, and also stories and sources.
In many ways, it was Chelsea Manning, WikiLeaks, and Julian Assange who first forced journalists to wake up and notice that digital technology was a powerful tool in that it gave whistleblowers a new way to reveal critical information and to do so on an unprecedented scale. Then came Edward Snowden. There are not many journalists who can say that they were there at the center of both of those stories, the way that James Ball can. He was an in-house journalist at WikiLeaks, worked alongside Assange, before joining The Guardian, where he worked on the Snowden files with Glenn Greenwald. And you can bet that the bulk of the emails between Ball and Greenwald relating to the NSA and Britain's GCHQ were encrypted. That story about the NSA tapping into the cell phone of Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany, it has James Ball's name on the byline. Eventually, he was named as one of the recipients of the Pulitzer Prize that The Guardian won for its work on the Snowden Story. I sat down with James Ball in London to get his take on encryption, source protection, and journalism in the post-Edward Snowden era. James Ball of The Guardian, thanks for joining us here at the Listening Post today.
Thank you.
First of all, in your communications with our producer when he was setting up this interview, did you guys encrypt?
We did not.
Why not?
Because, unfortunately, while we all should encrypt all the time,
yes,
in theory, in practice, have you ever tried getting anything done when you do that? Every day we have to compromise. I think if we try and tell people to be ultra secure, You know, if we were doing that in our homes, we would have 3 doors, bars on all the windows, etc. And it'd take us an hour to get out of the house.
So we shouldn't take it personally that you didn't bother to encrypt with us.
It does not mean you're not very important to me.
Before Edward Snowden, there was Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. Is it possible to summarize some of the changes in journalism that have occurred as a result of what WikiLeaks and Assange did first?
I think there's 2 pretty distinct lessons. I think from WikiLeaks and from Assange, journalists learned that we actually should share as much of our source material and our information as we can. We want to do it responsibly. You know, we've redacted on WikiLeaks and on Snowden. But instead of just saying, hey, here's our take on this, and trust us, we're the media, you know, Assange's approach really changed that, and that attitude looks really out of date now. You say, here's the story, here's the narrative, here's all the context that we can give you, but if you don't believe us, or if you want to check or see what you think, here's the raw material. And I think that kind of open journalism has really advanced in the last few years. I think the lesson from Snowden is quite a different one, and that's much more about, we've learnt that if we want to protect our sources, it's not just enough to say we wouldn't turn over their name to police. We've got to look at how we communicate with them, how we store our files, how we sort of secure everything, because we now know all of this stuff gets collected up and gets monitored.
You say you've done 130,000 air miles over the last couple of years, flying to meet people face to face to discuss things that you weren't prepared to send electronically. Apart from what that says about your size 22 carbon footprint, which I know does not go down well at The Guardian.
It does not.
What does that say about the level of trust that you have for encryption, or are we talking about the people that you were talking to?
I think it's a mixture of both. I think encryption, as far as we know, works. Edward Snowden thinks encryption, when it's very strong, when it's very well implemented, works. But there's 1,000,001 other little cracks. You know, you don't know if someone's got something just monitoring what keys you type in on your keyboard, or looking at travel in transit, or hypothetically, at the very extreme ends of surveillance, you might just have cameras recording what's on the screen. And so any kind of networked communication, anything electronic like that, we just couldn't ever feel was 100% secure. And because of the sensitivities of what we've been working on, for some issues, we just thought the only responsible way to deal with this stuff is to have face-to-face conversations.
Old school, in a park, in an underground parking lot, a la Watergate and Deep Throat?
So, does anyone do any journalism that isn't in underground parking lots?
Yeah, well, not according to the movie business, but so you're basically rolling the clock back in a way. So you're a digital guy,
yeah,
but you're rolling the clock back to an old school kind of journalism in certain instances.
Yeah, it's quite a strange thing, you know, to do this story that's all about how networks and the internet and technology has transformed our profession and the world. We were sort of really jumping back. We were working on computers that weren't connected to the internet. We were flying around and having actual physical meetings.
We looked at SecureDrop in the piece that preceded this interview. Can you give me an idea of how that one piece of technology, that one option, has changed things for you at The Guardian and for some of the people you're dealing with?
So SecureDrop's like a really nice shop front. It's a whole bunch of technologies that already exist, but it kind of gives them a brand and pulls them together so that for a potential source, it looks like this one good tool that they can use to communicate with us anonymously. The nice thing is, you know, it has taken every single precaution you can do. It clears logs, it advises people how to use it, it makes sure that everything is sent encrypted, and it makes sure it can only be opened on a computer that's not on the internet. And so it's the packaging that makes it quite sort of clever, and it's a nice pre-made shopfront for someone to send us something to and feel confident about.
Not to sound too paranoid, but as they say, it's not paranoia if they really are out to break your encryption.
Yep.
How do we know the NSA hasn't already done that? How do you know that your SecureDrop box is as secure as it says it is on the tin?
The absolutely honest answer is we can never say we know 100% that something's secure. We don't know the full capabilities. What we do know is this stuff is these types of encryptions, these standards, it's as good as we can get it. And there was nothing in the Snowden documents to suggest that encryption was made trivial. It's quite obvious in the documents that encryption is still a headache for them, especially mass collection. You know, if they want to read your email, they will probably get in. If they want to read everyone's to analyze it for stuff, encryption really slows them down.
After Snowden, with the NSA, all this talk of encryption, do you still run into journalists, be it inside your organization or outside, who don't get the encryption thing? And how do you sell it to them? What's the sales pitch?
The sales pitch is a simple one. If you are communicating with sensitive sources and you're not using encryption, and you're not thinking about security, you are putting them at unnecessary risk of exposure. And there is no such thing as a responsible journalist who doesn't use encryption. If you don't use this stuff, you're negligent. I think people have got a lot better than they did. You know, if you started talking about encryptions and air gaps sort of 18 months ago, your editor's eyes would glaze over. Whereas now, I think the top of any serious news organisation, these conversations are being had about how to protect sources.
Well, I guess the other way to look at it is Glenn Greenwald almost blew the story of his life because he couldn't be bothered or couldn't figure out the encryption tool.
Yeah, I mean, Glenn is, you know, phenomenal journalist, but he's not the world's most tech-savvy guy. I think Laura taught him a great deal, actually, but if people like Glenn could pick it up, he's, you know, he learnt it, he could do it all, it's fine. You know, if he can do it, other reporters should have no trouble. No, you don't have to retrain and do a computer science degree to get this stuff. Half a day and you'll be there.
There's a war on whistleblowing in the United States, certainly when it comes to the area of security. And before Snowden, there was Thomas Drake and John Kiriakou. The Obama administration has, as is well known to anybody in this field, prosecuted more Americans under the Espionage Act than all previous administrations combined. Given what people are now learning about encryption, are you seeing any signs that the trickle of information from whistleblowers is about to grow into something more significant than that?
One of the things to remember is, you know, before Chelsea Manning, the biggest ever leak was the Pentagon Papers from Daniel Ellsberg. And we went a very long time waiting for a sort of another mega leak on the Pentagon Papers scale. And then we got the Afghan war logs, the Iraq war logs, and the state cables, each bigger than the last. But then it's only been 4 years, 3 years between that and Edward Snowden surfacing. I think what's really sort of shows there is this kind of culture of secrecy, and is quite self-defeating. You know, the US government and the UK governments try and hold more and more stuff secret and try and do more and more behind closed doors. And that's where people seem motivated to expose it and to do something about it. The tricky thing for us as the media is as we kind of get into the second year of Snowden stuff, and when we've got loads of scoops, it's easy to keep reporting it and thinking about it. But all of this stuff is as important as it was, and the risks it poses to journalism are still there. But how do we sort of look at carrying on the conversation when it's not these big scoops every day? I think as media, you know, we've got to try and reflect in public and in private on actually, have we done enough? Have we changed enough? And what's still happening? And I think that's quite tough.
Are you seeing signs that encryption is being used to a significantly greater degree by people who aren't even journalists?
I think, yes. I mean, more people are using stuff like TOR, which protects your browsing. You start to see on Twitter now, at the end of people's bios, links to their PGP keys. And so I think people are picking up on it. But the difficulty is, certainly for a lot of journalists and a lot of non-journalists, it's not easy to use yet. You know, you go onto Gmail, it's easy, it's great. You know, WhatsApp, it's easy. When you try and use a secure app, it's not. And so I think there's now, one of the sort of post-Snowden implications is there's a market for good, easy privacy tech where you don't have to be, you know, a nerd like me to get it and to appreciate it.
James Ball from The Guardian, thanks for talking to us.
Thanks very much.
You've been watching a special edition of The Listening Post on journalism in the age of surveillance. If you're worried about who's tracking you on the web and want to know more about the tools and the methods that we've been talking about, just go to our Facebook page and you'll find all the links you need on the deep web. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.